very bright place. Do 23 minutes. Am I sharing? Yes.
Interrupted socialization process that conditions and
Hold on.
reflective, therefore absorbing less light, and the temperature will cool, which will make more ice form, which will make the surface even more reflective, which will cool the temperature further, which will make more ice form, etc., etc., etc. Feedback loops. And eventually all those little mirrors you put out aren't even necessary because the feedback loop has reinforced itself. Basically, feedback loops are why affirmative action is a good idea. So let's look back at the pipeline, but this time we're going to outline some feedback loops. I would have wanted to start at the end of the pipeline, but in reality, there is no end. The experience of minoritization and the impacts that has on a person and their work don't just end because you're a professor or something. But let's just simplify and say our higher ed bucket is the end. Professors who make admissions and or hiring decisions are, to an extent, determining the racial makeup of their workplace by deciding who is in their department and on a longer time scale, who's in the field. At the same time, they are affected by the racial makeup of their department and their field via something called white habitus. In a thoroughly data-driven piece of scholarship on race in the US, Eduardo Bonilla Silva defines white habitus as a racialized, uninterrupted socialization process that conditions and creates whites' racial tastes, perceptions, feelings, emotions, and their view on racial matters. The basic idea is that when white people are segregated from people of other races, and in the US, they generally are, the tendency will be for them to develop negative beliefs about the people they're segregated from in order to be able to explain the segregation as something other than segregation. So in the context of academia, what this means is that white people in predominantly white STEM departments, consciously or not, will likely explain the lack of diversity around them as minoritized people being fundamentally bad or uninterested in science. And these often unspoken and generally incorrect explanations for why there are no Black people around go on to prop up cultural beliefs like meritocracy that obscure this perpetuated bias from view. So if white admissions officers preferentially let in people of certain races, therefore determining the racial composition of their workplaces and fields, they'll have whatever negative beliefs they're operating under reinforced by the segregation they literally imposed on themselves. Feedback loops. Let's look back at our K through 12 ed circumstances that feed into the higher ed, where we talked about the ways discipline is employed to siphon Black students out of classrooms and into the criminal justice system. One patch for this leak, so to speak, is hiring more Black teachers. A large body of research has shown that Black students having experiences with Black teachers produces a wide range of positive outcomes. For example, connecting back to our point about discipline, Black students who have Black teachers experience reduced rates of exclusionary discipline at every level from elementary to high school, which, in light of our school to prison pipeline, is a very good thing. Unfortunately, American public school teachers are mostly white, disproportionately so. It's like 80% in the teacher population versus like 60% in the general population. And go.
So yeah, that's one of the things that I'm trying to do. I feel like you have to create, one of my professors said that you have to create spaces within spaces. So basically, like, you know, you have the major institutions who have their agendas or whatever, but it's a juggernaut and each one of us is like cogs in the machine, and we don't have to per se like do exactly what they want us to do within their machine. You know what I mean? That's what I mean by creating spaces within spaces. So you can be within a space that is supposed to be creating a certain result, and you can be creating a totally different result within that space. Okay. And so that's one of the things I'm trying to do. And I want to be a teacher. Like, I really do want to be a teacher. Like, that's what I've got pushing to do right now. Like on my LinkedIn, if you look at my LinkedIn, you would see, and I'm supposed to be graduating here in the fall. And my plan is to be teaching, as soon as possible, actually. I really kind of want to try to get in the fall already, if someone will hire me. And I'm going to apply everywhere and see if I can get in there. And it's like that's what I think. Like the children are the future, and I feel like the greatest impact that I can have in the world is by helping these kids. So hopefully I can do that.
Go figure, Black people are underrepresented as teachers by nearly a factor of 2. Knowing what we know, it would be only logical that if we were interested in improving the educational outcomes of Black students, we would want to hire more Black teachers. But unless you're in Florida, teachers need college degrees, so the racist practices preventing Black people from earning degrees in higher ed are stymieing our ability to diversify the body of teachers, thereby reducing racist practices in K-12 feedback loops. Finally, let's revisit those initial conditions. The things like housing discrimination that set Black people up for suboptimal educational experiences before they even start school. There are a lot of ways that having a degree can make it easier to change those things. You need a degree to be a lawyer who advocates against discriminatory practices in court, or a writer of public policy who rethinks the way a city funds education, or a mental health clinician who provides pro bono services to in-need parents. The list goes on. Credentials are helpful, which is why I was so upset by this study whose primary finding was literally that white admissions counselors are more responsive to Black students who present as deracialized and racially apolitical than they are to those who evince a commitment to anti-racism and racial justice.
And that's really interesting right there. And it's like, we'll let the Black person in, but the Black person that we want to let in is the one that's, not so radical, the one that's not so militant or whatever, the one that doesn't care too much about, Black people.
Basically, they did one of those audit studies where you send hundreds of letters from fake students to admissions officers and measure response rates. But instead of changing the race of the student, they changed whether or not the student talked about race in the letter. So like one set of letters was from a fake student with a Black sounding name who wrote about their commitment to saving the environment from climate catastrophe, while the other set of letters was from a fake student with a Black sounding name who wrote about their commitment to African American liberation. Can you guess which group the admissions officers were more amenable to? Can you guess why? This finding is really interesting in and of itself. It speaks volumes to the way superficially progressive diversity agendas function, where the goal is to look as diverse as possible while still maintaining the values and hierarchy that created that lack of diversity in the first place. We really do want Black students, just not the ones who are going to make their race like a thing. But in the context of our broader system, what this study is telling us is that at the point of college entry, the education system is literally screening for people that would challenge it. Like reactionaries who talk about there being no diversity of opinion in universities are like kind of right, but not in the way they think. It's this. In order for a Black person to gain access to the power conferred by academic degrees, whatever that is, but it's certainly something, right? They have to at least pretend not to be interested in disrupting the racial order, which means that the people who would theoretically go all the way through the pipeline because they just bootstrapped so damn hard and then take their education and go back and use that to improve the initial conditions that made the leaks in the first place, those people are being preferentially leaked out themselves because of higher ed gatekeeping.
Feedback loops. Yeah. Do I want to hear our takeaways on this, or do I want to not bore you anymore with this? I don't want to get a ding for the music either.
A few different takeaways I hope we can get from this model we've built up. One is that while on some level, yes, systems are institutions and policies and stuff like that, on another level, they're just people. At every single point in our model, there needed to be some person, whether a realtor or a teacher or a college admissions officer, who was there to perpetuate the system. And it just so happens that a lot of them have biases in the same direction.
So a lot of these biases that people have, they don't even know that they have them. It's like, it's subconscious, and like she said, like institutions, or when we talk about institutional racism, at every level, there's a person that makes a decision that leads to the outcomes that we have. And like I say, I think a lot of these people aren't doing it necessarily on purpose, but some of them absolutely are. But I would say that majority of them, it's more of a subconscious thing. A lot of it has to do with how, like, them preserving themselves, like for selfish reasons, to propel their career forward. And it's kind of like when we talk about journalism, and journalists get to choose what stories they want to write. But the editor doesn't tell them to stay away from these particular stories, like over here in this box. But the journalists know from intuition to stay away from these particular stories that are over here in this box, because they're not going to propel their career forward. So then they cover these stories over here, the ones that, you know, uh, upholds the status quo, if you will.
That is a direction that disadvantages Black people over white people, puts people like me somewhere in the middle, depending on how we behave. This is one of the points that Bonilla Silva uses to describe what it means for racism to be systemic. It emerges from the collective effect of many people's potentially unnoticed but nonetheless default racist tendencies that seem just like the normal way of doing thing and not any particular choice. Hence the title of his book I keep citing, Racism Without Racists. The other point that Bonilla Silva uses to describe what makes racism systemic is that it reproduces itself and therefore doesn't go away with time. In terms of our model, this means that the system creating racial disparities in education isn't a one-way flow. It reinforces itself. Underrepresentation in higher education is not solely the result of racism in K-12 education. It is simultaneously the cause of it. Every point within the system has the capacity to perpetuate or interrupt the rest of the system. And then this system goes on to interact with other systems. Education apparently interfaces with housing and criminal justice. Science education affects science policy, affects science industry. Racism intersects with sexism or ableism. Just a whole big mess of systems reproducing each other in this self-perpetuating blob of misery. And excuse me for being a very literal physicist about it, but the boundary we draw around something when we call it a system is only theoretically separate from the whole rest of the universe. In reality, absolutely everything is constantly interacting with absolutely everything, which is a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, so the systems perpetuate themselves. But what's important about what she said was, each person along the way has the power to perpetuate the system or disrupt it. So, but that's the same reason why institutions, the persons who end up in charge are people who perpetuate the system. And they look to hire folks that want to perpetuate the system. Someone who is disruptive is put as an outcast. They get fired, or they don't even ever get hired. Anyway.
Did you tell her to get away from me? She's crazy.
Hey, you have to draw